So welcome to our series on Fratelli Tutti, entitled Indifference is Not an Option, Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, and Solidarity. This is the first of a three-part series, and so we welcome all you today. This event is sponsored by the Harps Center for Catholic Thought and Culture and by the Office of Mission and Ministry of the University of San Diego. We'd like to welcome in particular President Harris, who is with us today. We're very thankful for his support. I have some bad news to report, and that is that Bishop McElroy will not be able to join us today, but he has provided a video with his comments. And so we will be hearing from Bishop McElroy through the miracle of modern technology. And we will begin with Dr. Reimer-Barry, followed by Dr. Nanko-Fernandez, and then we'll show the video of the bishop, and we'll follow that with questions and answers. We ask you to submit your questions and answers through the chat room. For best viewing of this event, you probably want to put your feed on speaker view. All of you will be muted until we get to the questions and answer period. So welcome to everyone. I am Jeffrey Burns. I'm the director of the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. And I would like to turn it over to our co-sponsor, Dr. Michael Lovett-Collier, who is the Assistant Vice President in charge of Mission and Ministry and Director of Campus Ministry. So Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you one and all for being with us today. It's really a pleasure to have so many of us together. For those of us at the university, we know this is week 3 of the semester and things are already really heating up. So we appreciate people taking time for this important conversation. I want to acknowledge that we are in the midst of Black History Month. And while every month and every week and every day is an appropriate time to acknowledge and celebrate Black lives, it's important, I think, to recognize that in that social friendship, what the Pope is talking about in this encyclical has something to say to us during this time of racial reckoning as we think about systemic racism. Also, I want to acknowledge that we're continue to be in this time of pandemic when we're so in many different ways isolated, when social friendship or friendship in general is different and harder. It is good that we can be together on Zoom, but oh, how I wish we were all in one room together. And then finally, I think it's important to remember that we are gathering today as an impeachment trial is taking place on the other side of the country. And it's based on events that happened on January 6th, which in some ways were the opposite of social friendship. So all that's a way of saying that our topic today, I think, is more relevant and more timely than ever. And I'm so grateful for our presenters, Dr. Nanko-Fernandez and Dr. Reimer-Barry and the bishop, and all of you for gathering for this important conversation. I have a fun job. I get to tell you how great our presenters are and how fortunate we are to have them with us. So first is Dr. Reimer-Barry. Dr. Emily Reimer-Barry serves as the Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at the University of San Diego. She's been here since 2008. She teaches undergraduate courses in Catholic theology, Christian ethics, sexual ethics, and ethical responses to HIV and AIDS. Her research interest areas include women's experiences of HIV and AIDS, cross-cultural analysis of gender roles and marriage traditions, ethnography and ethical methodology, and the intersection of public health and Catholic social teachings. Dr. Reimer-Barry earned her bachelor's degrees from the University of Notre Dame, a master's in theological studies from Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and her PhD from Loyola University in Chicago. This past September, she had an article published in Religious News Service, very timely and important article titled "Winning the Hearts and Minds of Catholics in a Church Divided." So we're really grateful to have Dr. Reimer-Barry with us today. We're also equally grateful and excited to have Dr. Carmen Nanko-Fernandez with us. We're especially grateful because she is officially on sabbatical, so thank you for making time for this during your sabbatical semester. Dr. Nanko-Fernandez is the Professor of Hispanic Theology and Ministry, as well as the Director of the Hispanic Theology and Ministry Program at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She identifies as a Latinx or Latinoa theologian whose scholarship focuses on Latinx theologies, Catholic social teaching, interreligious, ecumenical, and intercultural relations, immigration and migration, sport and theology, and the intersections between faith and popular culture with a particular attention to baseball or baseball. She's presented in a large number of different academic and pastoral venues, including Cooperstown, New York, and the Baseball Hall of Fame, which is very, very cool. Her appreciation for baseball is highlighted recently in Commonweal magazine. Just last week, Dr. Nanko-Fernandez had an article published titled Baseball, Baseball and Bad Hombres, the long relationship between the game and the border. I had a chance to read it last night. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. Dr. Nanko-Fernandez is also the co-editor, along with Gary Reeb Estrella, of the forthcoming book, Disruptive Cartographers, Remapping Theology Latinamente. She holds a Master of Arts degrees and a Doctor of Ministry degrees from Catholic University of America. And again, we're so happy to have you with us today, Dr. Nanko-Fernandez. And since Bishop McElroy can't be here in person, we'll just say that he's the Bishop of San Diego, and we continue to be really grateful that he is and that he's supportive of this series and of the university in general. I think most of us know Bishop McElroy has been our bishop for the last 5 years. Prior to that, he served as the auxiliary bishop of San Francisco for 5 years. He's originally from San Francisco, but we hope that he feels very much at home here in San Diego. So with all that said, I think I will now turn it over to Dr. Reimer-Barry, who will get us started.
Thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction. And it is a pleasure to be with you all today. Let me start my timer here so I can pay attention to how much time I have. And it is really an honor to be a panelist with Dr. Carmen Nanko-Fernandez, whom I haven't seen for some time now, but I remember hanging out with when I was a graduate student in Chicago. And I have really appreciated learning from your scholarship over the years. So I look forward to being in dialogue with you today. So my presentation is about indifference and what the Pope is inviting us to think about in this social encyclical. If you haven't had the opportunity to read Fratelli Tutti yet, then you can see from some of the key words in the chapter titles here that it starts with dark clouds over a closed world, and it ends with a more hopeful look towards the future, paths of renewed encounter, religions at the service of fraternity in our world, and then some closing prayers. And right there in the middle is a framework for a better kind of politics. Fratelli Tutti was promulgated on October 3rd, 2020. If you remember all the way back to October 3rd, 2020, we were in the midst of a very contested presidential election in the US context. And many read this document then as a rebuke of some of the rhetoric within that presidential election, and even of some of the candidates in their postures. I think it's a lot more than that. And some of the themes that we're going to point out today talk about both the invitation to think about solidarity and social friendship, but also the real challenge. And I have a note of caution in a number of places as I thought about this in light of current events, as Michael was describing. Part of the inspiration for this document was an encounter between Pope Francis and Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Tayeb in 2019 when they met in Abu Dhabi. And there they had a joint declaration where they said, and I quote, "God has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and has called them to live together as brothers and sisters." So Pope Francis says at the beginning of this encyclical, "I offer this social encyclical as a modest contribution to continued reflection, in the hope that in the face of present day attempts to eliminate or ignore others, we may prove capable of responding with a new vision of fraternity and social friendship." And of course, this is in the Franciscan tradition of reaching beyond Christian leaders, to embrace religious leaders from other traditions. We also see this in Laudato Si when Pope Francis says that the problems we face extend beyond, dialogues within and among Christians, but that these are global problems, and we're going to have to partner with people outside of our faith tradition in order to successfully navigate the challenges that we face in our global context. So whether it's about climate change in Laudato Si, or about political violence and disillusionment, which he's addressing in this document, he really is inviting us to reach out, in social friendship and sort of to perhaps go beyond our comfort zone, or to experience communion with the other, whoever the other is. He starts, like I said, talking about dark clouds. He emphasizes the COVID context. He also describes situations of nationalism, globalization, war, indifference, fake news, exploitation of the poor, racism. He uses the phrase shattered dreams, which is also the title of a famous sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whom he says inspired him. He talks about being in a throwaway world and how we treat people as if they're disposable. He says, where in practice, human rights are not equal for all. So it starts off with a kind of reality check. And while the document doesn't cite, evidence of some of these claims that he's making, I have some on here that can kind of remind us and give us a kind of reality check. So worldwide, 1 in 3 children is multidimensionally poor. In 57 countries, only 55% of women aged 15 to 49 years who are married or in a union make their own decisions about sexual relations. In the US, 1 in 6 people, including 1 in 4 children, experience food insecurity. So food insecurity means that little or no food is available at home, and those who are food insecure do not know how they will get their next meal. And as Michael indicated earlier, the movement for Black lives has helped to expose systemic racial injustices. And it's very appropriate for us as in a Catholic Christian context to talk about what this movement can help us to better understand in terms of how we might work for racial justice. Now, one of the quotes that I have seen frequently shared on social media is from number 30 within the document. And this is where Pope Francis says, in today's world, the sense of belonging to a single human family is fading, and the dream of working together for justice and peace seems an outdated utopia. What reigns instead is a cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference, born of deep disillusionment, concealed behind a deceptive illusion, thinking that we are all powerful while failing to realize that we are all in the same boat. And I can certainly see the appeal of this language, that we are all in the same boat. I think what the Pope is trying to do within this section is to emphasize that everyone who has human flesh needs to be working together to solve the social problems that we face. And so it's a call for unity, and it's a call to work together collaboratively. My word of caution, though, is that I also think we need to recognize the pervasive inequalities that persist, and not to to be realistic also when we see this through an intersectional framing. In other words, like the image here says, we're not all in the same boat, but we're in the same storm. So when I talk about this with my students, then I often draw on the scholarship of Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about intersectionality. And she does this by highlighting how racism and sexism intersect in the lives of Black women. And she's focusing on the US context, but this is applicable in a variety of situations. She says intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding how multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. So if you see on this slide in the top right, there's an image there of different kinds of boats within the same storm. And so maybe that could be a nudge to thinking, instead of, saying we're all in the same boat, which might serve to overlook some of the radical inequalities that continue to shape our world. We can recognize that some people are in a canoe and others are in a yacht, and then continue to think, as we diagnose the problem, how we can strategize together to solve those problems. Racism is one of the concerns of the Pope within the document. He addresses racism and ethnocentrism both directly and indirectly in the encyclical. So, for example, he says, instances of racism continue to shame us, for they show that our supposed social progress is not as real or definitive as we think. And he expresses gratitude to King, Tutu, and Gandhi for inspiring him. He repeats throughout that all human beings are created equal in dignity, and tends to focus on what it means to be a single human family as fellow travelers sharing the same flesh, instead of on human differences, whether they be racialized or gendered. And so, for example, he says, and this is a quote from number 147, "Let us realize that as our minds and hearts narrow, the less capable we become of understanding the world around us. Without encountering and relating to differences, it is hard to achieve a clear and complete understanding even of ourselves." So he's inviting us to understand differences, even as he's talking about common human rights and strategies for solidarity and collaboration. And when he talks about politics, then he repeats this claim that, again, is in line with the Catholic moral tradition, that politics must be truly at the service of the common good, that the end of politics is always the common good, not my good over the good of someone else, but the common good. In chapter 2, the Pope reinterprets the parable of the Good Samaritan. And here he shows how the Pope says that the parable shows how a community can be rebuilt by men and women who identify with the vulnerability of others, who reject the creation of a society of exclusion and act instead as neighbors, lifting up and rehabilitating the fallen for the sake of the common good. At the same time, it warns us about the attitude of those who think only of themselves and fail to shoulder the inevitable responsibilities of life as it is. We were created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love, he says. We cannot be indifferent to suffering. The decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. I'm going to have to move my thing here to get to the last part. Each day we have to decide whether to be good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. He continues, one detail about the passers-by does stand out. They were religious, devoted to the worship of God. This detail should not be overlooked. It shows that belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure that we are actually living in a way pleasing to God. So I think that's an important caution for us. If we think, well, I go to church, I must be good. He's encouraging us to think beyond just religious practice or religious devotion, and to think about action, especially in the context of service to the common good. And then finally, he says, let us not do this alone as individuals. The Samaritan discovered an innkeeper who would care for the man. So he's saying this is not purely individualistic. USD students would be really comfortable, I think, in talking about bystander intervention based on some of the outreach we've been doing about sexual violence prevention. I'm going to go through this slide quickly because I want to be sure that I have time for some of my later slides. But basically, becoming an active bystander is something that we've been talking about a lot on campus. Here's my word of caution, though, about the framework of the Good Samaritan parable and how to apply it today. So scholars of Christian ethics encourage readers to approach this parable with caution, because we often delude ourselves, telling ourselves that we are good and making excuses for why we can't do more. Scholars call this moral blindness or scotosis in the moral life. And that's something that I think can give us some pause in asking, who we are within the parable. Another challenge is that the story upholds a victim-savior typology, inviting the reader to take on the role of savior. But the savior complex, especially among white Christians in the US, often looks like cultural imperialism or, white people who want to fix the problems of other communities. A more nuanced understanding of structural violence and the agency of the sinned against survivor is also very important for us. And a third note on the parable of the Good Samaritan goes back to the issue of structural justice. So Martin Luther King Jr., in interpreting this parable, invited us to ask why the road to Jericho was unsafe in the first place. In other words, how can we think not only about responding to the neighbor in need, but transformation of social structures so that we prevent suffering to vulnerable others? So King said, what can we do to make the road to Jericho safe for everyone? So Pope Francis wants to make idealism a reality. The encyclical issues a call to listen to the vulnerable, a call to transform politics in service of the common good, a call to be kind, and an urgent appeal to peace and nonviolence, including an explicit rejection of war and of the death penalty. The Pope says all of this calls for an alternative way of thinking. Without an attempt to enter into that way of thinking, what I am saying here will sound wildly unrealistic. We need a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family. Oh no, I have one more minute. Okay, so then he says, well, I would argue that his theological anthropology focuses on the human person created in the image and likeness of God, open to persuasion and reasonable dialogue, and always capable of doing the good. In other words, I see him having a very positive theological anthropology. So my final question for us, and this is my last slide and where I'll end, is to ask, where is the Pope's theology of sin within this document? I tend to identify as a Christian realist in conversations about just war thinking and politics. And this is because I'm persuaded by the theological claim that our human experience is so wounded by sin as to infect our personal desire for stuff and power, our socialization and a racist and sexist and homophobic and transphobic culture, our social relationships, our relationship to our body and the natural world, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wonder, we're often very comfortable talking about the theology of sin in encyclicals about sexual ethics, but how can we also talk about a complex, rich, thick theology of sin in talking about social ethics? So the image on the slide here, I think, indicates some of the real concerns that a lot of us have about layers of sin within our political structures and discourse today. So Fratelli Tutti is an urgent call for peace and solidarity, but I wonder if a more nuanced understanding of the dangers we face with regard to the reality of both personal and social sin could have been more helpful. Because the last thing I want is for Pope Francis to be written off as naive or weak in the face of injustice. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reimer-Barry. Appreciate your comments. And now we'll transition to Dr. Nanko-Fernandez's sharing.
Oops. It's gone. Sorry, technical difficulties. It has disappeared. Okay, well, first of all, I'm trying to find it because it seems to have disappeared. I want to thank you for allowing me to be here with you because it's in the single digits here in Chicago with wind chills below 0. So I thank you for allowing me to spend my sabbatical minutes with you in what is definitely has to be a warmer climate. Michael, for some reason, we're having troubles with the slide share on this end. Is it allowing me in access?
Let me make sure that you're a host.
Yeah, because what happened was we practiced it and it worked. Because this would not be good.
I just made you host. Now, maybe you could give it another shot.
Well, I'll try it. Okay, thank you.
I wish I could come down the hall and help you.
So do I, because all that's showing up is the screen and nothing else. Can you, I honestly do not know what happened because this worked in practice.
Carmen, you shared a version with me earlier. Do you want me to share my screen and share your slides?
Let me try one more time because I don't know what has just happened since this worked in practice. So I don't know if something knocked out. Well, welcome to virtual reality. The backup plan might be to go to the bishop while we try to figure out what the technical difficulty is. Okay, I'm going to try it from the top. I guess Pope Francis didn't want this to go down.
Yeah, you know, that is an option. We could have you log off and log back in. And while you do that, we could show the video of the bishop.
That could work because I have a feeling that the connection here may have gone down. So that's why. This is just the last time. And if now we go to the bishop, and again, apologies from this end. We're trying it one more time and let's see if it works. If not, such is life. And there's the share screen. No, it's not showing up. Okay, yeah, if it's okay, can we go to the bishop and I'll see what went wrong here.
Okay,
Thanks, sorry about that.
no problem.
Michael, would you like me to start?
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be able to speak here today in collaboration with Dr. Nanko-Fernandez and Dr. Reimer-Barry as we wrestle with the questions that Fratelli Tutti pose to us, because they are deeply penetrating questions that call for a whole conversion of heart and soul and spirit. The encyclical begins with words that Saint Francis of Assisi gave to the members of his community. Now, other than the Blessed Mother, I personally believe that Saint Francis is the greatest saint in the history of the Church, precisely because he grew up and he was ensnared by all of the limitations and prejudices of his time that brought up barriers between him and others, that taught him a way of life that was closed and guarded. And yet, in the midst of that life, he discovered in his relationship with God and his relationship with every other human being and ultimately the whole of creation, a way to break through those categories and barriers and to see in every person truly a brother or a sister in the most intimate terms. Pope Francis says to us that we must undergo that same conversion of heart and soul that St. Francis did. The Pope in the encyclical outlines at great length all of the barriers to a truly Christian way of life that lay around us in our world. The Pope says, we need to live a life truly with the flavor of the gospel. And that means resisting those who would keep away, cast away, sacrifice, and ignore all those who are different, who are the other, whether they be immigrants or refugees, whether they be the unborn or those who are cast aside in our society because of their class and level of education, whether they be those who are excluded by racism and ethnic prejudice, which are so deep in our society and our world. Pope Francis says in this encyclical, we must confront all of these in our lives first. Before we can become transformers of the world, we have to do a deep and profound examination of our conscience and challenge ourselves to understand in what way we erect the same barriers in our lives and allow those barriers to control us and to limit our lives as disciples of Jesus Christ. I believe that the central part of Fratelli Tutti is the Pope's reflection upon the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, we all think we know the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who comes down the road who is filled with love, the priest and the Levite who are empty and indifferent, the man beaten by the robbers themselves. But we have heard this parable so many times that we take for granted its deeper message. All we really think about when we think of the parable is caricatures of those figures: the robber, the Samaritan, the victim, the priest, and the Levite. Pope Francis calls us to go deeper into the parable and to understand that in these characters is us. Each one of them represents part of who we are in our lives. And if we're really going to transform the world in a profound way, we have to wrestle with these parts of our character and heart and soul and identity to be converted and transformed. The Pope says this: if we extend our gaze to the history of our own lives and that of the entire world, all of us are or have been like each of the characters in the gospel. All of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the Good Samaritan, something of the priest and the Levite. And I would just like for a few minutes to reflect on how we can undertake such an examination. The figure of the Good Samaritan is the white hat in the parable. He's the one we always want to think of ourselves as being. And yet, he is an unusual man. He comes across this scene, and we think, oh, it was just a question. Should he help the man who'd been victimized by the robbers or not? We don't see the dilemma as the Good Samaritan saw it. He's coming down the road. There's a man lying by the side of the road who's been deeply beaten and victimized by robbers. And he has to think to himself on the spur of the moment, am I going to risk myself to help him? This was a dangerous road, scripture scholars tell us. Moreover, the Samaritan didn't know if the robbers were still around or whether they're hiding or trying to get other people there, or whether the victim himself was simply a lure. This was a risky thing for the Good Samaritan to do. And yet he didn't flinch in doing so. He went over, he gave of himself, he put himself at risk, he took care of the victim, and he saw him as a human being and saw him up and healed and continued to care for him. But it's the risk that's really important here. I believe that most of the time we fail in our duty in crucial moments of being Good Samaritans because we are not willing to take a risk. The second figure is that of the robbers. We don't really see them, but they're there. And we understand that they have been consumed in this part of their life by darkness, by evil, by selfishness. And they have become creatures of the darkness, as it were. Those who victimize a man so badly, who beat him up, who leave him alone, perhaps to die. Pope Francis asks us in the parable and in his exposition of it to see ourselves in the robbers. And this is a very difficult thing to do, especially those of us who are involved in work with solidarity. To see ourselves in the robbers and to try to examine the areas of our life in which we are not the white hat, in which we let evil come too close to us and obscure our gaze and lead us into actions which, without our full intention sometimes, are deeply devastating to others in their structures, in their effects, and in the direct harm that we do. Next, we come to the victim in the parable. And it is vitally important in considering the victim in our own lives that we not engage in some type of moral equivalency, which indicates that we are victimized in the same ways, with the same depths and outrages that so many in our world are, as immigrants, as people of color, as those who are poor and marginalized, as the homeless. No, we must see ourselves as victims because it is crucially important for us to understand what it means to be beaten and what it means to be cast aside and neglected. And it is in those experiences that we can capture and create the empathy, the genuine empathy we need to have for all who are truly and much more dramatically victimized than many of us have been. And thus, we need to reflect upon our experiences when we have been the other and what that means and how that hurts. And in that reflection, come to a profound sense of connectedness and empathy with these deeper outrages that are in our world, that harm so many, that cast them aside, that label them as the other. For it is only through empathy that we can truly serve those who have been marginalized. And it is through empathy largely that we can help others come to see their relationship as brothers and sisters with all those who are victims. Finally, we come to those two figures on the road we do not like to associate ourselves with, but probably most often reflect: the priest and the Levite. They were probably very good men on a variety of levels, to their family and their communities, to the religious community whom they served. And yet, in the crucial command of God to reach out to brothers and sisters in need, to see them as one like us, because we are all children of the one God, they failed. All of the categories of their time taught them, do not stop for this man. He is unclean. Do not stop for him. We don't know who he is or whether he's worthwhile. And so they pass on. And for most of us, the great sin of not having that kind of gospel love lies in indifference. And we can't ever cease to struggle with that. In these days and weeks to come, we will be struggling with Fratelli Tutti and its deeper meaning for all of us in the world in which we live, where there is so much of otherness, so much of casting people off, so much of marginalizing them. And I hope and pray that all of us working together, reflecting together, might come closer to that magnificent type of love that St. Francis had and seeks to bestow on his community and all of us today, as he calls them brothers and sisters and asks them to follow the gospel command of love.
Okay. We're gonna need some help from Michael because for some reason, the video is the slide share is not allowing me to do so from here. So what just happened? Why are we having troubles? And can we put it in presentation mode, please, Michael? Thank you. And the great theologian Roberto Goizueta once wrote that humility is an important part of being a theologian, and I think I'm about to learn all of that right now. So I thank you for your patience, and I thank Goizueta for pretty much summing up what the life of a theologian probably really should be, especially in the age where Zoom incarnates us. But I'm still grateful to be in warm San Diego, and though I'm looking at snow at this very moment. So I guess I'd like to frame my remarks as a theology of encounter en la lucha, a theology of encounter in the struggle. And Michael, I'm dependent upon your graciousness to, if you could move to the next slide. I thank you for this invitation, and I come to this invitation with the spirit that Pope Francis intended when he wrote Fratelli Tutti, which is one that's an invitation to dialogue. And I see all of us here who've gathered to be in that spirit. Francis said that we should seek the dialogue, whether that's in a relaxed conversation or a passionate debate. Right now, I'm thinking relaxed conversation might be probably better for all of our nerves in light of what's happening, as you've mentioned, in the District of Columbia today. And that part of dialogue also encourages us to walk together, to be together in moments of silence and in suffering, and to embrace the wider experiences of peoples beyond ourselves. And so I humbly come to you from that stance so that we can think together about this very important encyclical, and grateful to both Emily Reimer-Barry, who it has been a pleasure to know for many years, and to Bishop McElroy virtually. Michael, every single one of us comes to Fratelli Tutti, as we come to all things, as particular interpreters. What does that mean? It means we're all coming from various places, situatedness. We're contextualized in different realities. We are embodied in different ways and informed by various experiences. So on to the next one, what I would say is that I read Fratelli Tutti as a Latino theologian. In other words, the first thing that caught my attention in this encyclical is number 135, the papal shout out to Latinos in the United States. Latino culture is a ferment of values and possibilities that can greatly enrich the United States. The Pope saw us, and for the first time in any papal document and encyclical, a particular community in the United States was signaled out in a significant way. And with Fratelli Tutti, the whole notion that resonates as well with Latino theologians is that there can't be any dialogue unless we find ourselves comfortable in our own rootedness and in our own identities. We can't engage in dialogue or be open to encounter if at first we don't understand and recognize the gift that is us in terms of the fullness of our identities, as well as the limitations and the biases that they bring. Michael. I think this resonates with a poet that many of you may be familiar with, the Chicano poet Francisco Alarcón, who died not all that long ago, who was born in California, but went as a child to Mexico and then came back and considered himself to be a binational poet who actually wrote in 3 languages, Spanish, English, and Nahuatl. And that whole notion of what Francis says, I think, is encapsulated in Alarcón's notion of that our roots are something that we carry with us at all times, and I use them as my pillow. And Francis himself, if you notice, has a great fondness for poetry and what we would call the literature and the works of lo popular, of popular culture, popular music, popular sport, and popular religion. I read Fratelli Tutti as a Latino theologian, and what I mean by that is that I am formed and informed within a community of greater wisdom that is of 5 decades worth of theologizing done from within Latino communities in the USA, and that you have been blessed at USD to have very many members from that community, including our pioneers like Orlando Espín, Maria Pilar Aquino, as well as some of our rising stars like Victor Carmona. What that means is that I am familiar. In other words, I am part of the family, a cousin, a prima, so to speak, of Latin American theologies, including the theologies that nurture Francis, theologies like Teología del Pueblo that come from Argentina and are part of the greater stream of liberation theologies. In this case, it's a theology that exercises an option for culture, much like Latino theologies do, as well as exercise an option for the poor and vulnerable. With Pope Francis, I would have said that I too participate in social friendships and very much embrace his understanding of social friendship as the crossing of borders. To be from a particular place and to share from particular cultures is essential in exploring the richness of any text or any sign of the time that we find ourselves being immersed within analytically as well as lived experience. And what Francis says is he makes a difference between universal, which means an opening of ourselves out to others beyond our own local and particularity, and universalizing, which means to just take us and flatten us all into just one undecipherable, indistinguishable, uniform, standardized, colorless blank. In other words, what he calls utter monotony. And he makes a distinction. From our particularities, we open ourselves up to engage at intersections, as opposed to universalizing as we are all one, look the same, sound the same, and difference has no value. So with Francis, I think our Latino theologies as well appreciate that. Fratelli Tutti addresses las luchas en lo cotidiano. In other words, Fratelli Tutti finds itself in the struggles of our daily lives, our lived daily experiences, these everyday struggles. However, and while the bishop was good to point out the personal conversion that's needed, both Emily's reflections and my own, I think, point out that there's also structural and systemic issues that are at the heart of what Francis is talking about here. Inequities, dominance, destructions that have impacted our relationships between us as peoples at all levels, between us as nations, and between human beings and the rest of creation, which is something that he deals with both in Querida Amazonia y Laudato Si. If you look at Fratelli Tutti and you're familiar with the corpus of Pope Francis's works, everything from his homilies through his messages to his few encyclicals, what you'll notice is that he has remained consistent. There are certain themes that keep recurring, and they recur here as well in Fratelli Tutti: culture of encounter, belonging, the disenfranchisement of the so-called disposable, dialogue, inclusion, solidarity, making options. However, I would like to propose today 3 keys that I think might help us also to dig into Pope Francis's thoughts. And the first I want to call the contextual key. And what I mean by that is there's something different about Fratelli Tutti. And that difference is COVID-19, a global and globalizing pandemic. And what that virus does is exacerbates everything, including the social, it basically outs our social viruses, our racism, our xenophobia, our nationalism, our individualism, our destruction of the earth, our destruction of each other, poverty, all of that he now has a contextual key for, and that would be COVID. To me, besides the lens that I look at through number 135, the Latino shout out, the most striking line in Fratelli Tutti appears early in number 19. They did not have to die that way. To me, this is also personal. My friend and mentor, Monsignor Richard Guastella, did not have to die that way on Holy Thursday, barely 6 weeks into the epidemic. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor did not have to die that way. Migrants trying to cross the borders or the Mediterranean do not have to die that way. And I think what winds up happening is that for Francis, the pandemic functions in 4 key ways as a contextual key. Number 1, in consistency with the popes who have come before him in Vatican II, he reads the signs of the times in our daily, in lo quotidiano. And the pandemic is a clear global sign of our time. And it impacts everything, including the fact of how we're even gathered here today. 2, as a locus theologicus, in other words, the pandemic is the content, context, and ground from which Francis begins his theologizing. I'm not sure the pandemic helps him to focus and crystallize. Number 3, the pandemic for him is both a metaphor and a lived experience that outs intersecting social viruses. The COVID-19 basically unveils, reveals all the injustices that I just mentioned a few seconds ago. And 4, I think he understands fraternity and our need to recognize our global and universal kinship. I think he appreciates that, and what he does in Fratelli Tutti is to offer us both a prescription and a balm. In other words, a balm, B-A-L-M. I have to be careful with my New York accent. It's not a B-O-M-B, but a B-A-L-M. In the sense that he sees what he is proposing as a way for us to move, to vaccinate ourselves in ways that open us to not just this virus, but all that it requires of us in terms of the care for creation, the care for each other, and the building of bridges among our nations. Why do I think this? Because he brings this up just the other day when he gathers in his annual meeting with the diplomatic corps that's assigned to the Holy See. And he brings this up. Fraternity is the cure, not just for the pandemic, but for the many evils that affect us. So that's the contextual key. The next key is the hermeneutical and homiletic key, which I think that both Bishop McElroy and Professor Reimer-Barry did a really good job of sort of putting out there for us. The stranger on the road parable is not new to Francis. He has been reflecting on this for the longest time. Here's just a short list. And most recently, just 10 days ago, he used it again in his address to Italian catechists. Right? And each time you read him, you find something new that he brings out. And I'm not going to repeat anything that Emily or McElroy said, but I guess what I want to move forward to is that the hermeneutical and homiletic key of, and if the next slide, please, Michael, is the robbers. Because with the robbers, I think the bishop does a good job of talking about how the robbers are, we need to look at ourselves and our characters and how do we function that way. But Francis does something new with the robbers that he has not yet done in other iterations of his reflections. He says, we've seen the robbers. We have seen them in the shadows of neglect and violence. And then he asks this other kind of odd question. Are we going to abandon the injured man and run after to take refuge? Or are we going to go chase the robbers? Which is kind of a sort of haunting question. It's more haunting when he then reminds us, and this would be in section 75, that we are allies of the robbers. So it's not just that we pass by and we look the other way or we're indifferent, but that indifference, that passing by, makes us complicit with those who manipulate and cheat in society, that we too are responsible. So I would say that in this, Francis pushes his hermeneutic a step further by inviting us to also ask questions about how are we complicit in violence? How are we complicit in all that occurs on the road? And who's going to hold us and each other accountable? So in terms of a hermeneutical lens, I would say that Francis reads the signs of the times through the lens of the Good Samaritan parable, or the stranger on the road, as he sometimes calls it. And he reads the Good Samaritan or the stranger on the road parable through the signs of whatever times he is again reflecting on this text. And then I would like to propose a third key. For lack of a better term, I would call it the Catholic social teaching key. And as has already been mentioned by your own USD beloved professor, is that solidarity comes out in force in this encyclical. He doesn't invent solidarity. He definitely picks up where John Paul II left off. And in many ways, in looking at the corpus of Francis's work, I would say it's kind of a fair thing to say that John Paul II does for solidarity what Pope Francis does for the option for the poor and vulnerable. John Paul II expanded the understanding of solidarity in significant ways to get us to think about it in terms beyond some sort of shallow empathy that so people are suffering, thank God it's not me. And what we wanted to see was a parity that not only were those who suffered, because the whole notion of if one suffers, we all suffer, but that in order to address the situation, we had to view those who suffer and those who were not as partners, not as one being the recipient of the charity of the other. Francis pushes this even further. And Francis, I think, pushes this further because in some ways, the pandemic forces him to go even further. And he tries to concretize that in Fratelli Tutti. And he basically tells us that engaging in sporadic acts of generosity is just not solidarity. In other words, consistent with what John Paul II is saying. But he wants us to start thinking concretely in terms of community. What does that mean? He pushes this, if you look carefully, when he starts talking about private property. So prior to the appropriation of goods by a few, it's the needs of the many. He calls us out because he also gets direct and says, and when we're not paying attention to the destructive effects of the empire of money. And he again reiterates sort of the parallel to what Bishop McElroy points out, that this is not just personal. It's about the combating. It's solidarity in order to combat structural causes for the many issues that intersect and have now come to the fore even more so with the pandemic. Oh, I'm sorry, Michael. Among the many obstacles, he points out many obstacles to solidarity, individualism, nationalism, economic disparity. But he coins a really great term that he calls local narcissism. And it connects back to what we were talking about, how our particular cultures and identities are important and good, But then he warns us of the dangers that can also happen if we become so focused on our own navels, so focused on ourselves, that we're no longer really a community that's outgoing. And he calls this local narcissism. And he roots the problem with local narcissism as an obstacle to solidarity is that it's built and rooted in insecurity and fear. And it leads to something that you can very much appreciate on the San Diego-Tijuana border, the desire to erect walls for self-defense, both physical walls as well as metaphorical walls. And he says, unless you're open to the universal, unless you're being challenged by what is happening in your heart, what's happening in other places, unless you're open to being enriched by people not your own, then you don't have, and unless you allow the tragedies to touch you in ways that move you to action, then you're just not in solidarity. You're missing the spirit of solidarity. So he calls us to go outside of ourselves. And the next slide. But one of the things that makes Francis so accessible that people appreciate is that when he talks about these concepts, which is a principle in social teaching, he gets concrete. So he's saying it's not just a lovely principle that we have, that we should treat each other as neighbors. He gets down and says, and how do we live this? By having common projects. Where do we see this? I've seen this in neighborhoods where people accompany each other and neighbors get together to do something together. I've seen this, and he raises up in here in Fratelli Tutti, migration as an example of how we can concretely practice solidarity, and even points out practical national policies that can be enacted on the part of receiving nations and sending nations. He sees it as an international opportunity, but he gets practical. And he returns to something that also, Emily graciously reminded us of. He likes to talk about dreams because he thinks that solidarity is basically cultivated in the dreams. And his most basic unit of dream is the young with the elders. And when elders and the young dream together and are in conjunto, that is where he sees as one of the most basic units of solidarity, of practical solidarity. And my question, Emily left you with sin. I'm going to leave you with a different question. In reading Francis, there's a line that pops up in 137, which he says, we are either all saved together or no one is saved. Now, clearly, he's talking about the pandemic. He's talking about the ecological crisis. He's talking about economic disparities. But I'm thinking that he's pushing Francis thinks in many ways out loud, and he develops these themes through his audiences, his catechesis, etc., including Fratelli Tutti. The street guide of Fratelli Tutti, read the audiences that occur in the 6 weeks before it's released. But what I think he's asking, this is a really important question to him because it pops up again. It pops up on January 2nd when the La Gazzetta dello Sport, which is the Italian daily on sports, like Italy's Sports Illustrated. All right. When he has this extended interview, and in the middle of that interview, he says, no one is saved alone. So if you need it in sports language, it's like we could only be saved as a team. And then not 28 days later, it appears again. No one is saved alone. We come out of it together. And this time it's in an address to the catechists of the Italian Episcopal Conference. I think this is on his mind. And my question is he moving us to another key, a theological key, that solidarity is going to invite us in practice, in principle, to considering new ways beyond the personalist and individualist ways we have come to consider salvation. So for the fancy, $5 theological term, is there soteriological significance in solidarity? And is this where this Pope is taking us next? In conclusion, the last slides here. Pope Francis thinks and writes, at least it's my contention, in hyperlinks. So he puts things in that may mean nothing to you unless you click on the link and follow where it goes. Very deep in Fratelli Tutti is probably the first example of a samba appearing in an encyclical. It's in number 214, for those of you who want to go check it out. It's footnote 204, for those of you who want to look it up. And I've also provided a link for those of you who want to hear it. And I would say that you may actually want to read Fratelli Tutti while listening to this samba from the 1960s. It's called Samba de Benacau, and apologies for my bad Portuguese. The line that he takes from it in English is not a great translation, but it goes, life for all its confrontations is the art of encounter. But if you look at the Portuguese, some Brazilians have also pointed out that there's a play on words going on with encounter and, like, for lack of a better English expression, disencounter or discord. Life for all its confrontation is the art of the encounter. But remembering that Francis plays in hyperlinks, and for the last slide now, if you read the song, and I've put for you parts of the English translation, I'm actually going to close where my good friend Emily began. Emily began with the notion of Francis begins Fratelli Tutti with an interreligious dimension. I'm going to say that I think he also includes another interreligious dimension, to borrow from the work of your own Orlando Espín. If you know anything about samba, it's Afro-Brazilian music. And in this particular samba, it's an Afro-Brazilian song and dance that draws as well and calls out the names of the orishas. In other words, it's building off of, it's a blessing and a prayer that is rooted in Afro-diasporic religion. Yet another form of an interreligious dialogue with the community that are far on the margins. It's his shout out to Amazonia. It's his shout out to his homeland. And it's another example of how lo popular, or that which is popular, whether in religion or culture, is part of Francis's theologizing, because in Teología del Pueblo, like in Latino theologies, we make a preferential option for culture as well. And if you read that samba, I think that these words as well are the words that would appear from this samba of blessing. A good samba is a form of prayer, because samba is sorrow and sways. And sorrow always has a hope. Sorrow always has a hope of one day not being sad anymore. And in many ways, I think these words also illuminate, sum up, and reveal some of the insights of Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti. So thank you, Michael, and thank you all for your patience.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And thank you again, Emily. And of course, we thank the bishop for his video presentation. That was wonderful. I want to make sure we have time to collect questions from the audience. So if those of you who have been listening would like to ask a question of our panelists, please go ahead and enter them into the chat, and I'll put them forward to our guests. I wonder though, maybe I'll get us started by asking, maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Reimer-Barry, and then give Dr. Nanko-Fernandez a chance to catch our breath. If you had to summarize the primary significance of this encyclical, what, I know that's hard to do, but what would you point to one particular theme or issue?
The primary significance. Well, I think that's such a tough question, but I think it's working together to solve the many problems that we face in our world, but it's the challenge of working together. You know, he never lets anyone off the hook. And it's this invitation to keep trying, even if we fail, get up and keep trying and keep working at it. And yeah, I think that collaboration, cooperation, empathy, you know, these are all, you know, some of the major themes that I would say I would privilege. You know, it also got a lot of press. Obviously, solidarity and soteriology, as Dr. Nanko-Fernandez was just elaborating. I mean, I think those are such important themes. It got a lot of press for that, and then also for rebuking the kind of negative politics that we were seeing when this came out, a real kind of crisis of negativity within our political landscape. And so a lot of folks saw this as a real hopeful presentation of what our political context could be, and a rebuke of some of that negativity. But yeah, and then a rebuke of the death penalty, a rejection of war. There's just so much in here. It's impossible to boil it down to one. That's an impossible question, Michael.
Yes, I realize that, but thank you. I think that's really helpful. Your collection of some of the primary takeaways or themes. Thank you. Dr. Nanko-Fernandez, would you want to say anything about that?
One, I agree with Emily that that's an impossible question, because this is like a 7-chapter book, and he covers a lot of ground. But I would actually go back to the pandemic, because I don't think Fratelli Tutti comes out the way it does without the pandemic. He's very consistent with his own thought, and watching Francis across the very many ways that he communicates, from homilies to audiences to messages. He has more. If you put all of that together, you have Fratelli Tutti in a lot of ways, because these are issues he's been thinking about for a very long time. However, the pandemic crystallizes this in a new way, because it's finally an issue that the entire globe is experiencing in real time at the same time. Parts of us may be involved in wars at any given time, but even the things that we call world wars, while they impact the entire war, don't always have the same combatants. Mm-hmm. So I think that, but there's something about this is like, yes, every part of the globe, every section of our country. And I think in some ways, why it's theologically significant, it really points to the value of theologies that begin on the ground. And theologies that begin in the time and in the moment. That doesn't mean to say that anything he says in here will not have meaning beyond this moment. But it does say theologies are not in ivory towers. And if you look, one of the fascinating things to do with Francis is look at his footnotes. And this one only has, the real shout out is the samba. But if you look at, for example, Querida Amazonia, every other footnote is a poet. There's music, there's poetry, and he does that in a lot of his sort of work. So in one way, it makes it time specific, but in another way, it makes us open up to the reality that yes, this time is a theological time that does not have to stand for all time, but it can help us think forward. I'm really curious to see if he builds any sort of further development on that sort of soteriological question of we're all safe together. I'm looking, because if you notice and you follow him, he kind of throws something, then he thinks it through in a whole bunch of documents that appear or messages that appear later, like he did with the Good Samaritan. That's like a great example of him doing that.
Let me just throw in one comment here. Dorothy Day was very fond of the notion of we're all saved together. And she would quote Pagee, when the person shows up for judgment in heaven and Peter asks, where are the others? Mm-hmm. So we come together for it. So, Michael?
Yeah, well, to pick up on that theme a little bit longer, Dr. Nanko-Fernandez, there's a question about what kind of ecclesiology does this new view or this emerging view of soteriology entail? In other words, if we're saved together, what does that imply about the way we are church?
Yeah, and I think there's two questions there too, because the way we are church together, and obviously this is a very trying time for what that means. But I also go back to what he says at the beginning of Fratelli Tutti and what's been an ongoing theme, which is that the church, our society, our creation is defined by the fact of its diversity. and that there's an openness to what it means to be church is not a universalizing concept. So how do we, in our richness, as well as in our various poverties and biases and limitations, come together and work together in ways that are furthering projects of solidarity? I think one of the problems we have with Catholic social teaching is it has no pictures. And I think Francis is trying to give us pictures. What does solidarity looks like? It's like your family when
Yeah, she might be frozen, huh?
Yeah, she is frozen.
Okay. Well, we'll hope that she'll jump back in here with that theme of what pictures, what does solidarity look like? Another question might, oh,
no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
maybe to ask Dr. Reimer-Barry to speak a little bit about, there's concern about the title and fraternity and whether or not that is appropriate, from a inclusive perspective. So I guess, Dr. Reimer-Barry, would you be willing to talk a little bit about that title? How does that strike you? Would you have, in an ideal world, suggested a different word for that Francis was trying to get at?
So I think that's a great question. I think that we need to keep working on our problem of sexism and our problem of clericalism within Catholicism. And I appreciate how Pope Francis has named clericalism as a sin. And I appreciate how he talks about women's rights as human rights within this document. In speaking to those who are fluent in Italian, I came to understand that in Italian, this is perceived as being more inclusive than it was, originally understood in English translations. But I do understand the concern about who counts as human being a very important contested question that we need to keep wrestling with. And one of the ways that I see this happening, even in the way that encyclicals show us the kind of dialogue that is possible, is that Pope Francis is not citing women. And so that gets to the question. It's beautiful that Dr. Nanko-Fernandez is pointing out he's citing poets, he's citing musicians, and of course, attention to decentering a Eurocentric framework is very, very important. But where are the women? I think we just have to keep asking, where are the women? And then it's somewhat ironic that in this panel we have two women and a disembodied cleric. So I think even today, it's a shame that Bishop McElroy couldn't be with us live, but we need to continue to foster spaces where women have a voice and can shape the positions of the magisterium understood through these clerical spaces. And I would actually argue with Dr. Espin and others that magisterium should be understood much more holistically. But I appreciate that question. I don't have the same concern about Fratelli Tutti itself in terms of the title, but it's really more of a methodological concern of with whom is the Pope in dialogue and how can the concerns of women be much more significant. And so we just saw, for example, that there's going to be a female undersecretary at the next synod and she's going to have the right to vote. Well, that's great. One or two women will have the right to vote. It feels odd to celebrate it in that way, so we've come so far and yet have so far to go.
Thank you. We're getting near our end time of 2:00. I wonder if Dr. Nanko-Fernandez, would you want to say anything kind of at the end, a summary or concluding remarks?
Well, yeah, actually, I want to go back to the question that you've just asked, because I think it's a way to conclude. There's many ways of looking at it. And because Francis always hypertext, I guess I was confused too by why he went with what was a Latin phrase and put it into Italian, because, in Querida Amazonia, he kept it in Spanish. So So he plays with words. Laudato si, he kept in Umbrian. He kept that in medieval Umbrian. So I was confused as to why he did do that. And I think, thank you, Emily, for explaining about the Italian. But I think there's also that phrase has another whole story to it in Italy, which is that Tutti Fratelli was said by women during the war, when it was the war for Italian independence. And it's a story at the founding of the Red Cross, where the battlefield wounded were brought to a church, literally a field hospital, and they were cared for from all sides of the battle. And the women from the town came to take care of the soldiers, and they looked at them in their mess, and they said, they are all brothers in their suffering and their struggle. So I think when somebody from the Red Cross hears that, they think of their founding story. I personally would not have gone with fraternity. I think it's a bad translation to it, because it does to me, it reminds me of the French Revolution. But I think in Spanish, I probably would have gone with hermandad, which is a word that means like sister brotherhood, but without any of the genderized it. And the other word, I guess, that some have been using is kinship. Siblinghood is a bit like awkward. But I do think that the critique still remains, because it's a reminder to us too that language sometimes can open up worlds, but it also can cause bad memories and damages of those who get excluded unintentionally. So I think Fratelli Tutti is a step forward in causing us to look at all of these things. And also it's an open opportunity to say, it's okay to say, I'm not really happy with your title, Pope Francis, but I get why you did it. But did you think maybe you should have looked a little deeper? Because for him, language matters. And, but there's more. This was far from a comprehensive conversation about it's really a wonderful piece of work. And thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Reimer-Barry, would you have any concluding remarks that you'd like to share?
Well, first, gratitude to all of you for inviting me, and I learned so much from Dr. Nanko-Fernandez's presentation, so thank you for that. I received a question in the chat about my claim that Pope Francis might be naive with regard to rejecting war and the death penalty. So maybe I'll end by just talking about briefly what I mean by saying that I'm a Christian realist, and the concerns of some Christian realists in that section of the document. And that's to say that, just war theorists would interpret the love commandment as saying that sometimes love requires the use of force in order to protect the vulnerable. And so, for example, the responsibility to protect doctrine of the United Nations. And I'm concerned that Pope Francis is on a trajectory of nonviolence and pacifism, which is appropriate as the head of the Catholic Church, but to the extent that this is persuading religious and political leaders who might take this as an opportunity to be less involved in situations of real political conflict. That's where I have some concern. And so thinking about Christian realism means recognizing the reality of how sin is pervasive in the world, and thinking through how we can participate in such a way as to reduce harm and to care for the vulnerable, and to use the power that we do have in order to transform those structures that are broken, but also to ensure that we don't have a naive understanding of the reality of evil that we face in doing that. And so I really think that there's a lot going on there, but that was part of what I was trying to say, that there's a certain way in which pacifism, is a real challenge. But when we start to talk about global conflict and politics, there's just so much more that we need to say and think about and wrestle with. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Well, I want to thank everyone for attending. Particular thanks to Dr. Nanko-Fernandez and Dr. Reimer-Barry. Of course, thanks to our Bishop McElroy. Our discussion of this will continue next week, same time, 12:30. We're going to host Dr. Massimo Fagioli, the great Vatican scholar and professor from Villanova. So if you're interested, register for next week. Thank you all again. Thanks. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Christine. This presentation will be made available on our YouTube channel if anybody would like to review this today. Right. Thank you all. We'll see you next week.
Bye.